The other element is sport. And for Germany, particularly, the World Championships in football were incredibly important. And sport, as we well know, is again one of these things that has a positive impact on that. And of course, we've already talked about food. This isn't exactly a very interesting place, but it does say kebab, wraps, baguettes, burgers. These are sort of various countries in there. So what's that? America, France, well, you're a burger too. Well, anyway, you get the drift. But you see lots of places like that. I'm not saying it's the best food, but it's well, it could be very good food, actually. And then, of course, there's the casual encounter in the street, which, again, it's useful, but it's often not really deep enough. You know, these people are all together. This happens to be a picture of New York. Well, are they communicating? They're probably not. They're just walking past each other. So I just thought that was quite useful just to think a bit about where do we meet? What are the experiences where we meet that tend to have a sort of slightly deeper impact? And what's particularly important is finding in the city is neutral territories where people come together. This happens to be Central Park here. But those areas, and that's what the city in theory is good about, is having these central places that are neutral, where we come from the suburbs or whatever, into the core in one way to bump into each other. But there are also other ways which are slightly different. This is the Heidelberg project in Detroit that you probably know, which in itself, I think, is a project of bringing people together. And this mad artist, Tyrone Gurry, I think his name is, he's done this massive artwork, which is basically about the communities in a very declining place, bringing them together, and as it says there, building bridges and so on. Or here in Toronto, again, where two traditions, religious traditions, are being displayed at the same time. They're happening in the same time, in the same places. So you can still be who you want to be, but you are still, in one way or another, connecting with somewhere else. So what I'm really talking about, in part also, is now where does this happen? These are just some words. You can read them yourself: libraries, parks, community centres, markets, and cafes, and so on. But ironically, these are precisely the places, certainly in Europe, which are under threat. Library budgets are going down, community centres are having difficult funding. All of these places where people tend to meet together are, certainly in Europe, having great problems in surviving. And then we come to tourism, of course. Tourism, there are lots of tourist buses. I haven't seen too many here yet, but I hope I will. But the issue is, what form of tourism are we talking about? This is just tourist buses, you see, they're all everywhere. Christ, this is going on and on and on. Now, if we think of tourism, and I won't repeat what Ramona said this morning, but clearly we've had various developments, haven't we? Leisure tourism, cultural tourism, which you described very clearly. But the other word that is very much in vogue at the moment is creative tourism. Some people sort of invented that term. But the point here is trying to go one step further, which is actually really connecting with you. So being in one of your areas, let's say Del Sol, and then doing something there with the people there, even though I'm an outsider. So whatever that might be, it may be crafts, but it may be just, I don't know, taking a cooking course or something like that. I did that once in Santa Fe, which I thought was, well, I learned to cook. A fragment of cooking I learned. But anyway, you get the idea. It's the actual doing something together. Now, if tourism, as you said today, earlier, is in a sense discovering the unknown, perhaps the first tourism strategy, I know you've got tourism strategies in this region, is the strategy to discover yourself. As I was driving around yesterday, I was feeling that all of us should be discovering each other, which in itself is a form of very, very local tourism. But I leave that up to you to decide whether you want to do that. And here are just a couple of the places we visited yesterday on our tour. You probably know most of them. You don't know that, though. That was opposite the Downtowner. But, there's more to Minneapolis St. Paul's than burgers, I'm sure. Now, just to go a bit into sort of the bigger dynamics, we all know that the economy has moved and changed and has become more service-oriented, knowledge-intensive, and so on. And But now people increasingly talk about it's not only a knowledge economy, it has to be a creative economy, because in order to get knowledge, you first need to be open-minded and creative in order to get an invention. It doesn't happen first. It's the precondition is the need to be creative. Now, given that most big cities that you can think of that were on the map that we heard this morning are thinking about that, the question is for you, what is your emerging advantage? What are you going to do, not differently, because I think you need to do that in any case, but that's an interesting challenge for you to consider. And if you take that on board, you have to then really say that this could be a sort of paradigm shift, because it really means the city is operating differently. The industrial city is very different from a knowledge-intensive city. And that puts every place in some way or other at a crossroads about how it puts together the things it needs strategically in terms of economic development, cultural development, and so on. Now, some people feel this is all too much, keep things as they are, we've done it in the tried and tested ways. Other people, by contrast, and I think you're this other group, who say this is all very invigorating. So this is the invigoration group here, I presume, rather than the scary group. But what it means really is you have to drag out some of the preconceptions we've had about how cities work. Now, if we look at a place, and this is me just summarizing in very simplistic terms, that is livable and creative, i.e. gives you opportunities to do things, it has a couple of features. One, it's a place of obviously rootedness in some sense. It's a place of possibility where you feel you can do things, fulfill your ambitions. It's a place where you can connect physically. That may be a bit difficult because, sorry about this, but American cities are a bit, oh my God. Where you can connect in some sort of sense. A place where you can learn and relearn and be switched on, and obviously a place that sometimes inspires you. And I think it's quite interesting to look at your city from that perspective, because we mostly look at the city simply from a technical point of view. What are the roads doing, all of that sort of stuff. Roads are important. I'm not against roads, but a lot of asphalt does give you a feeling of asphalt as endlessness. But I mean, that's a separate issue, but just think about psychologically what that feels like. So the rootedness thing, acknowledging where one comes from in some sense is incredibly important, I think, because unless you're anchored, you can't in a sense. If you're well anchored, I've found that people are much more willing to change and open out in general, because in essence, the city is a place of connection, meeting, trading, talking, discussing, doing things, transacting in one way or another, and then obviously occasionally perhaps playing or whatever else. But that is the heart of a city. The city is, that's why it exists. It's the place where apparently you have more possibilities than you do in the village and so on, where there are more connections, more ideas and so on occurring. And one of the interesting things I feel I want to throw at you when you're doing your developments, is this thing you're doing a city of projects, a place of individual projects, all the things we heard from the mayor, deputy mayor earlier, or is the project the city? Easy to say, difficult to do, completely different mindset. One's very integrated thinking, holistic, connecting things. The other saying, I'm just going to make my profit on this little thing here. I don't care what happens elsewhere. So, some examples of cities trying to be intercultural. Now, I'm going to just show things because I knew that Ramona was talking today this morning, which are beyond the tourist repertoire that we are aware of. The point, it's exotic, which we don't want all of this to be exotic at all, but restaurants, crafts, shops, festivals, and so on. All of those things are very important, but let's just see whether some of these other things translate into, these examples I'm giving, into an interest in the place and therefore ultimately some form of tourism. Now, one of the first ones, conviviality, which means living together, is Rotterdam. This is a thing which is called meeting on the Maas. Rotterdam has over 50% of people who don't come from Rotterdam. So here people who already live there and others come in, they sit round a table and do a bit of speed dating on their interests. So I happen to know that guy who's got the long nose there on the left, in fact, is a football fan who's going to take someone from Somalia to a football match. I'm not quite sure what these two ladies ultimately decided to do. But you see what I'm saying? They just decide to do things together which are their joint interests. They don't know each other yet. I think it's quite a good project, just as an example. Meeting on the Maas. The Maas is their river. Another example, which let's talk about this later, but it's fantastic. It's called City Safari, where basically about 600 people in Rotterdam have agreed to be visited. You get vouchers and you select, you say, oh, I want to meet, let's say I'm saying, I want to meet an urban planner.